The Kremlin is gambling and is trying to high stakes, and not just in Ukraine and in Syria as well. So they have no other choice but to speed up aggression in both directions and not to be in compliance with all international obligations. So recently, Vladimir Putin admitted that there are Russian troops in the Donbas area because they, as he said, were protecting the Russian-speaking minorities over there. So we see that Russia is, in first place, they were lying about their presence in Crimea and in Donbas, but now they are admitting it, which is pretty good progress. But I believe that with more pressure towards Russia and possible more sanctions, or sanctions not just with regard to the violence in Donbas and occupation of Crimea, but also with regard to the human rights violation, the crimes against humanity in Syria, this pressure, amounted pressure, will push Putin to accept the negotiation, to fulfill his obligation under the so-called Minsk agreements and as well as other international agreements and treaties. It's the right direction for such a body, and I believe that Ukrainian diplomacy and especially parliamentary diplomacy won this battle, and it will be used not just within this important but not obligatory body of the democratic community, but also within the European Parliament, and it will be a good argument against those who want to cease sanctions from Russia, to save the face of Mr. Putin, to encourage him to live up to his obligations. Possibly they will make a move out of this body at all. Just a couple of years ago, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Russian Parliament said that human rights is not of the Russian tradition, and that's why a violation of human rights it's normal practice in Russia, as we see not just in occupied Crimea and Donbas, but also on the mainland of Russia. And the same thing with democratic standards. One of the resolutions passed by the Assembly was stating that the whole legitimacy of the new elected Duma is questionable, because the Ukrainians that are in Crimea were voting in these parliamentary elections, and there are 4 members of parliament voted from Crimea, and also Crimeans voted in the party list. So the Parliamentary Assembly said that the whole of the Parliament of Russia is illegitimate, which is absolutely right thing to do. So the pressure from the democratic free world on Russia will result by the end of the day in the compliance of this country with its international obligations. The West is trying to employ a 3-stage strategy. Firstly, to strengthen their allies the Americans are strengthening allies in Europe and NATO allies, the Baltic states, Poland, and the NATO states in the Black Sea region. Secondly, they are boosting support to Ukraine with regard to the defense issues, as well as the general governance and economic reforms and macroeconomic stability. And thirdly, they are trying to keep communications channels open, just to convey Russians that there is no threat posed from the NATO to Russia, which is true, and there is a way how to get out of this confrontation. So the West is trying to talk to Russians. There is no how to say, freezing of communications, but from the other hand, it's impossible to communicate in some areas. For example, Mr. Putin was about to visit Paris to talk with President Hollande on Syria and the other different issues, but because of the rising violence committed crimes by the Assad regime and the Russian Air Force, bombing the civil objects and especially hospitals, Mr. Hollande decided to step down from these talks. And it was a move right after the Russian delegations voted for the fifth time against the draft of the resolution of the United Nations Security Council to cease fire, to impose the no-flying area over territory of Syria with the aim to get humanitarian relief to those devastated areas of Aleppo and others. And Russia is blocking it. It's not in interest of Russia. Vice versa, escalation is in interest of Russia. Getting back Aleppo by the Assad-controlled army and pushing the West to negotiate with Assad, keeping his in power. At the same time, we believe that such an action has its byproduct, but which is the most important byproduct for Russia. The huge waves of refugees are coming to the European states, and they are putting pressure on the national governments. And by doing this, Russia is trying to crack down the whole European unity, and a lot of countries are suffering from such a cause. They are trying to break the sanctions over Russia. And if you have a look at those who voted against two resolutions in past year, the majority of them are Italian. There are some German members of parliament. So this is the countries where the huge support is present with those politicians who are in favor of the Putin's returning back to business as usual.